When things get too much for me, I put a wildflower book and a couple of sandwiches in my pockets and go down to the south shore of Staten Island and wander around a while in one of the old cemeteries down there. I go to the cemetery of the Woodrow Methodist Church on Woodrow Road in the Woodrow community, or to the cemetery of St. Luke's Episcopal Church on the Arthur Kill Road in the Rossville community of Rossville that isn't used any longer and is known as the Old Rossville Burying Ground. The South Shore is the most rural part of the island, and all of these cemeteries are bordered on at least two sides by woods. Scrub trees grow on some of the graves, and weeds and wildflowers grow on many of them. Here and there, in order to see the design on a gravestone, it is necessary to pull aside a tangle of vines. The older gravestones are made of slate, brownstone, and marble, and the designs on them, death's heads, angels, hourglasses, hands pointing upward, recumbent lambs, anchors, lilies, weeping willows, and roses on broken stems, are beautifully carved. The names on the gravestones are mainly Dutch, such as Wynant, Houseman, Woglam, Decker, and Van Nam, or Huguenot, such as Disesway, Seguin, Dehart, Manny, and Sharratt, or English, such as Ross, Drake, Bush, Cole, and Clay. All of the old South Shore farming and oyster planting families are represented, and members of a half a dozen generations of some families lie side by side. In St. Luke's Cemetery, there is a huge old apple tree that drops a sprinkling of small, wormy, lopsided apples on the graves beneath it every September. And in the Woodrow Methodist Cemetery, there is a patch of wild strawberries. Invariably, for some reason I don't know and don't want to know, after I have spent an hour or so in one of these cemeteries, looking at gravestone designs and reading inscriptions and identifying wildflowers and scaring rabbits out of the weeds and reflecting on the end that awaits me and awaits us all, my spirits lift, I become quite cheerful, and then I go for a long walk.
What's up, party people, and welcome back to another episode of NYC Foodways, your weekly food and culture discussion from the cultural capital of the world. My name is John, and this week's episode is dedicated to the life and legacy of Mac Rebenak, aka Dr. John. His obituary in the Times was embarrassingly scant considering the generational talent we lost with his passing. This week on NYC Foodways, we bring you part one of our series on the food-loving patron saint of this channel, Joseph Mitchell. Born 1908, deceased 1996, Joseph Mitchell came to New York City from North Carolina at the age of 21. After working at various newspapers around town, along with a few adventurous flights of fancy that ring very true to the host of this channel, Mitchell landed at the New Yorker in 1938, where he, over the course of decades, largely formed the voice of the magazine as we know it today. In 1956, the New Yorker published the story Mr. Hunter's Grave, the opening section of which you heard to start this video. In Mr. Hunter's Grave, after wandering through his favorite Staten Island graveyard, Mitchell eventually crosses paths with one Mr. George Hunter, aged 87 years, who brings Mitchell into his home, his life's narrative, and eventually to the site of his final resting place. Mr. Hunter is a patriarch of the dwindling Sandy Ground community, originally founded by free people of color before the Civil War. At one time, Sandy Ground was quite a prosperous place due to the abundance of nearby oyster beds, but at the time of Mitchell's writing, the community had been hollowed out by environmental and economic degradation, and there were not too many residents left. Mr. Hunter is a perfect character to hear from via Mitchell, a quick-witted, multi-talented, self-sufficient New Yorker who indulges in the time-honored New York pastimes of speaking at length about oneself and grousing about how one's neighborhood simply isn't what it used to be. Mitchell records several historic Staten Island foodways in this piece, as Sandy Ground was, after all, an oyster town. There are numerous observations of produce, both wild and farmed, lengthy discussions of herbs, herbalism, and foraging, descriptions of church clam bakes and ox roasts, and a recounting of the Sandy Ground residents' extensive utilization of canning and preserving. There is beautiful prose centered around Mr. Hunter's passion for baking and cooking, especially his love of cakes. Even the opening line has the word sandwich in it. I find Mitchell's pieces to be so compelling because his itinerant wanderings and keenly-eyed observations expose a lover of all things New York, both all things in New York and all things of New York. That is, both the tangible and the metaphysical aspects of our fair city. And nowhere is this more true than in Mr. Hunter's grave. Mitchell's observations of the physical world run into the hundreds, while still being very much focused on our inevitable passage into the unknown. The margins of any ecosystem are its most fertile region, and the margins of Staten Island, itself the most marginal borough by far, proved to be a perfect staging ground for Mitchell's sharp eye, honed instincts, and bent ears. And the piece is only partly about food. Like most good writing, Mr. Hunter's grave takes into account the essential duality of existence, namely that of life and death. In this case, the life and death of oyster beds, of fishing communities, of families, loved ones, and the self, of churches, of neighborhoods, of kinship networks, of ways of being, of ways of organizing, and ultimately, ways of life. Mitchell seems to know that Mr. Hunter's grave will ultimately hold more than his coffin, and does his damnedest to make sure we know what enormity is due to leave our world when Mr. Hunter enters his grave. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for another episode of NYC Foodways. Peace.